When sovereignty shattered. Imagine waking up to breaking news that the United States military had conducted a raid inside a sovereign nation, not in the Middle East, not in Afghanistan, but in South America, and arrested that country's sitting president. That's exactly what happened when U.S. forces carried out a direct military operation inside Venezuela, leading to the stunning arrest of President Nicolás Maduro. In one swift, calculated move, America ended years of diplomatic stalemate and plunged an entire region and potentially the world into uncharted waters. This wasn't a Hollywood script, this was real, and the shockwaves are still spreading across continents, threatening to destabilize global markets, reshape alliances, and possibly ignite a conflict that pulls in superpowers from Beijing to Moscow. The question everyone is asking now: could the arrest of one controversial leader in a struggling South American nation actually trigger World War III? To understand the answer, we need to rewind and see how we got here and why this single event might be the most dangerous geopolitical gamble of the decade. What just happened? For years, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela has been toxic. Washington accused Maduro's government of running a narco-state, committing widespread human rights abuses, rigging elections, and driving millions of Venezuelans into poverty and exile. Sanctions piled up, diplomatic channels froze, but nothing changed. Then, without warning, it all came to a head. In a coordinated operation that stunned the international community, U.S. military and intelligence forces entered Venezuelan territory and apprehended President Nicolás Maduro. The U.S. government justified the action by citing overwhelming evidence of drug trafficking networks operating at the highest levels of the Venezuelan government, ongoing humanitarian crises, and the collapse of democratic institutions. Washington framed the operation as a necessary intervention to dismantle criminal enterprises and pave the way for democratic restoration. But here's the thing: no matter how you spin it, this was a direct violation of Venezuela's sovereignty. The U.S. didn't ask permission, there was no UN mandate, no international coalition, just unilateral action on foreign soil. The reaction inside Venezuela was immediate and chaotic. Some Venezuelans, exhausted by years of economic collapse, food shortages, hyperinflation, and authoritarian rule, quietly celebrated. They saw Maduro's arrest as the end of a nightmare. But others, loyal to the government or simply fearful of what comes next, worried about foreign occupation, civil war, or worse, becoming a pawn in someone else's game. Globally, the response was sharply divided. U.S. allies were caught off guard, many remaining conspicuously silent. Latin American nations erupted in anger, calling it an act of imperialism. And then came the heavyweights: Russia, China, and Iran, all of whom have deep ties to Venezuela, condemned the operation in the strongest terms, calling it illegal aggression and a dangerous precedent. This wasn't just about Maduro anymore. It was about what happens when one superpower decides the rules don't apply. Why did this happen? The powder keg that finally exploded. To understand why the U.S. took such a drastic step, you have to look at the accumulation of pressure over decades, not just years. The economic collapse. Venezuela, despite sitting on the largest proven reserves of oil in the world, has been in free fall for over a decade. Hyperinflation made the currency worthless. Basic goods disappeared from shelves. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Millions fled the country, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. The government, rather than reform, doubled down on authoritarianism. Drug trafficking allegations. For years, U.S. agencies accused high-ranking Venezuelan officials, including Maduro himself, of colluding with drug cartels, particularly in facilitating cocaine trafficking routes from Colombia through Venezuela to the U.S. and Europe. The U.S. Department of Justice even indicted Maduro on narco-terrorism charges back in 2020, offering a $15 million reward for his capture. But arresting a sitting head of state, that was always considered too extreme, until now. Geopolitical chess. Venezuela's alliances made it more than just a regional problem. Russia deployed military advisors and equipment to Venezuela. China invested billions in infrastructure and oil deals. Iran shipped fuel and forged economic ties. Suddenly, America's backyard had become a playground for its biggest rivals. That was unacceptable to Washington's strategic planners. Domestic pressure in the U.S. American politicians on both sides faced mounting pressure to do something about the Venezuelan crisis, especially as millions of Venezuelan migrants moved northward, many eventually reaching the U.S. border. The humanitarian angle mixed with national security concerns created a storm that demanded action. So when intelligence suggested an opportunity to capture Maduro with minimal casualties, the decision was made. Risky? Absolutely. Unprecedented in modern times? Yes. But from Washington's perspective, the status quo was untenable. The global economic impact, markets, oil, and uncertainty. The arrest sent immediate ripples through global markets, and the long-term impact could be catastrophic or transformative depending on how the situation unfolds.
Oil prices and energy security. Venezuela's oil is some of the heaviest and most difficult to refine, but it's still critical to global supply chains. The uncertainty following Maduro's arrest caused oil prices to spike initially. Traders feared that instability in Venezuela could disrupt production, especially if internal conflict erupts or if foreign powers intervene militarily. If Venezuela's oil infrastructure collapses further, or if other nations embargo Venezuelan oil in retaliation, prices could skyrocket. That means higher gas prices, increased shipping costs, and inflationary pressure worldwide. Countries heavily dependent on energy imports would be hit hardest. On the flip side, if the U.S. manages to stabilize Venezuela and restore production under a new government, it could eventually ease global oil markets. But that's a big if. Supply chains and trade disruptions. Latin America is deeply interconnected economically. Colombia, Brazil, and Caribbean nations all have significant trade relationships with Venezuela. Instability there threatens regional supply chains, particularly in food, energy, and raw materials. If violence breaks out, refugee flows will intensify, straining neighboring economies and potentially destabilizing borders. The economic burden of millions more displaced people could push fragile economies over the edge. Financial markets react. Stock markets hate uncertainty, and this situation is dripping with it. Defense stocks initially surged as investors anticipated military escalation. Emerging market funds took a hit as investors fled risk. Safe haven assets like gold and U.S. Treasury bonds saw inflows. If tensions escalate into actual military conflict, especially involving Russia, China, and Iran, expect severe market volatility, potential crashes, and a flight to safety that could freeze credit markets. Sanctions and economic warfare. Russia and China immediately threatened economic retaliation. Russia hinted at restricting energy exports to Europe. China suggested disrupting supply chains for critical goods. Iran could destabilize oil flows in the Middle East. This isn't just about Venezuela, it's about testing the global order. Economic warfare in the 21st century doesn't always involve bullets. It involves rare earth minerals, semiconductors, energy supplies, and financial systems. A coordinated response from U.S. adversaries could cripple industries, spike inflation, and trigger recessions across multiple continents. Could this trigger World War III? The terrifying possibilities. Let's be clear, World War III won't start because of Venezuela alone, but history teaches us that world wars rarely start from a single cause. They ignite when tensions, alliances, and miscalculations collide at the worst possible moment. The alliance web. Here's the nightmare scenario. Russia, China, and Iran all have strategic interests in Venezuela. They've invested billions. They have personnel on the ground. They've publicly backed Maduro's government. Now the U.S. has essentially overthrown him by force. If any of these powers decide to defend their interests militarily, the situation escalates rapidly. Imagine Russian ships moving toward Venezuelan waters, Chinese military advisors refusing to leave, Iranian-backed militias mobilizing. Suddenly, you have a proxy war, or worse, direct confrontation between nuclear powers in South America. The domino effect. If the US gets away with this in Venezuela, what stops it from trying the same in Nicaragua, Cuba, or elsewhere? Other authoritarian regimes will feel threatened. Russia and China will feel compelled to draw harder lines. Every regional conflict becomes a potential flashpoint. Cyber and hybrid warfare. Modern wars don't always look like traditional invasions. Russia has already demonstrated cyber capabilities that can cripple infrastructure. China controls vast supply chains. Iran sponsors asymmetric warfare. Retaliation doesn't have to happen in Venezuela. It could happen in New York's power grid, Taiwan's shipping lanes, or Europe's gas pipelines. Nuclear brinkmanship. The most terrifying possibility is that escalation leads to nuclear posturing. Russia has hinted before that it considers Latin America within its sphere of influence, just as the US does. If Moscow believes Washington is encroaching aggressively, we enter a dangerous game of chicken, one where miscalculation could be catastrophic. Is World War III likely? The honest answer: probably not. Not yet. Despite the rhetoric, major powers generally prefer economic and proxy conflicts over direct war. The costs are too high, the risks too great. But we're closer than we've been in decades. The arrest of Maduro isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a broader pattern of great power competition, declining respect for international norms, and rising willingness to use force. If internal chaos in Venezuela spirals, if foreign troops clash, if cyber attacks escalate, or if miscommunication leads to unintended military engagement, then yes, this could be the spark that historians point to when they write about how the world stumbled into a war nobody wanted. What happens next? The world is watching to see if this bold gamble pays off or if it unravels to disaster. For everyday people, the impact is already being felt: rising gas prices, market instability, and growing anxiety about what comes next. For global powers, it's a test of resolve, alliances, and whether the international order still means anything. The next few months will be critical. Watch for military movements, economic sanctions, cyber attacks, and diplomatic negotiations. Watch for how Russia, China, and Iran respond. Watch for whether Venezuela descends into chaos or finds stability.